discussion, I would like to talk about the India-China economic relation. In fact, now we are talking about banning the Chinese products, banning the Chinese apps. 59 apps have been recently banned by Government of India. What is the exact position? What is the present position of our bilateral economic relations? In the background of the standoff between India and China along the line of actual control, especially in the Ladakh region, a lot of sentiments have been raised, and I would like to discuss about what is the present position of our bilateral economic relations. First of all, let me just give you a small background. See, the trade relations between India and China, it started in 1970. After the war, the formal trade relations started only in 1978. 6 years later, in 1984, both countries offered most favored nation MFN status to each other. So we offered MFN status to each other 6 years later. And by early 2000, in fact in 2000, our bilateral trade was worth $3 billion. That's all, less than $3 billion. That's all in the year 2000. But since then, the trade started multiplying. By 2011, our bilateral trade reached almost $74 billion. And since then, there was a reduction. In fact, in 2016, the bilateral trade was $71 billion. But a big issue at that time was that by this time, the trade deficit between the two countries, India's exports to China was always lesser than China's export to India. The trade deficit in 2011 was $51 billion because we are importing more and exporting less. In 2018-19, if you look, the total trade was worth $90 billion, $90.4 billion worth bilateral trade between India and China took place, and out of which $57.4 billion were trade deficit for India. That means China exported $73.9 billion worth item out of this 90. So 73, and India exported only $16.5 billion worth items. So India's export only 16.5, but Chinese export to India was 73.9. The gap was 57.4. That is what we are talking as the trade deficit. So now what is happening is, say in June, say 2020, if you look, the China is accounting for almost 5% of our export. I mean, of the total exports we are having, 5% of our exports are to China. But when it comes to imports, it's almost 14% of India's imports are from China. It is almost $74 billion worth items we are importing. And right now, China is the second largest trade partner for India after USA. And many of our vital ingredients we are importing from China. In fact, if you look at the Chinese investments in India, I'll just come to the trade once again, but first of all, let me just talk about the Chinese investments in India. The foreign direct investment, if you are looking, in the metallurgical industries, in renewable energy sector, in electrical equipments, in automotive and chemical sector, according to a calculation which is done recently by Bloomberg, they have found that in 2019, $4.1 billion worth investment, foreign direct investments were from China, 4.1. So it's not a big amount, but around 800 Chinese companies are there in the domestic market right now. 800 Chinese companies are there in the domestic market right now, and also there are around 75 manufacturing facilities for smartphones, consumer appliances, construction equipments, power gear, automobiles, optical fiber, chemicals. Many of these our mobile phone companies like Oppo, Vivo, Hair, all these companies have manufacturing facilities in India right now. And also, so not only the foreign direct investment of more than $4 billion in 2019, China is also very much, the Chinese companies are very much engaged in our Indian startup companies. In fact, Chinese funds are very regularly coming to India, but one problem here is most of these Chinese funds are not directly coming from China. Many a times it is coming through Singapore or Hong Kong or to Mauritius. So that's a big, it's very difficult to find out what is the actual investment of Chinese in India. For example, in Paytm, we all know that there is a substantial Chinese investment, but Alibaba Group's investment it has not come directly from China, it has come through their Alibaba Singapore Holdings Private Limited. So that means Alibaba is not directly, so it is not counted as a Chinese investment in India. Paytm's investment is coming routed through Singapore. So Singapore, it will come as foreign direct investment from Singapore, but actually it is a Chinese company. So this is the problem. We may not be able to make out also. So it will not be recorded properly, or how much is the actual investment from China, especially in the startup companies and all, we may not be able to know, because many a times these are routed through other places like Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And recently it was found that in March 2020, it was found that out of the 18 India's 30 unicorns are China fund. 18 out of 30 unicorns are those privately held startup companies were valued over more than $1 billion. And this term unicorn was coined in 2013. And now 18 out of 30 unicorns in India, which are valued, these startups which are valued more than $1 billion today, they are funded with Chinese funding is there. So it's a massive funding. And when it coming back to our export, China's exports to India, not only, many a times, we have this feeling that China is only exporting cheap products to India, finished goods to India. They are not only doing finished goods, they are also exporting electronics, pharmaceuticals. In fact, recently it was found that in 17-18, for example, almost 60% of India's import requirements of electrical and electronic equipment, 60%. Not a small amount, 60% of our electrical and electronic equipments are met from China. The requirements are met from China. And more than 75% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, 75% of active pharmaceutical ingredients are from China. The raw materials are coming from China. And it is in fact, these ingredients are very crucial for our generic drugs. India is a champion of the generic drugs, but many of these active ingredients are coming from China. And more than 80% of the antibiotics are imported from China. So, and more than 60% of the electronic goods I already said. So, these are very key economic sectors for us. So, these key sectors of Indian economy are dependent on China. In fact, not only this, exactly if you look at that, there was a data recently published, it was said that in telephone and communication apparatus, 73% of the imports are coming from, of the total import, 73% are coming from China. In semiconductor devices, 82% are coming from China. Automatic data processing machines, including computers, 64% are coming from China. Then, antibiotics, I already said more than 80%, monitors and projectors, 54%. So, naturally, we are critically, so these are intermediary products in many cases, and we are critically dependent on the imports from China. Similarly, when it comes to India's exports to China, see, most of the Indian exports are, we can say, intermediary products or raw materials. It's not the finished goods. So, these include cathodes, petroleum oil, intermediary products for the production of film, plastics, etc. And in fact, it was found that the manufactured products constitute 55% of India's non-oil exports. So from India, the manufactured product, how much we are exporting only $16.5 billion worth items. And in that, around 55% are manufactured items, but that is too less. And whereas China, it is manufactured or the intermediary products or the final finished products, it is 95%. For China's exports to India, 95% are finished or intermediary products. But India's exports, just 55% are finished or intermediary products. So naturally, ours more of raw material based and intermediary goods, whereas Chinese are more finished goods and intermediary products. So there is a definitely there is a difference in our focus or rather the concentration in these items. In fact, when it comes to the exports to China, we added, in fact, around 2018-19, we could increase our export to China a bit, mainly because of the petroleum product, especially from the Reliance Industries aromatic production. We were able to export more intermediary goods to China. That is why our exports increased to 16.5%. Earlier it was less than $10 billion worth exports only were taking place in 17 and 18 and all. So we could increase a bit that is mainly because of the petroleum products, and that too from the Reliance facilities. Otherwise, we were not able to export much. And even now, another important component of our export is fish, crustaceans, raw cotton. So all these things are definitely raw materials rather than, or other primary goods rather than manufactured or finished goods. So the bottom line, the conclusion I would like to say is that with China, there is a huge trade deficit. We are critically dependent on some of these items, especially these intermediary goods in electronics, in antibiotics, in pharmaceuticals. So we are, if you are talking about a trade ban right now, this will definitely be hurting India, our manufacturers, those manufacturers who are dependent on those intermediary goods. So it may not be that easy to talk about this trade ban or increasing the tariff and all those things. And most importantly, please remember, in an economic situation where our our economy is not performing so good, at this stage, if you are going for increasing tariffs and reducing the import from China, it will be hurting our industry equally or more than what China's economy may be hurt. So as far as the bilateral economic deals are concerned, the three things we should remember: one is the bilateral trade. Definitely India is crucially dependent on many imports. Then in the startup companies, Chinese investments are there. If you try to stop that, definitely in the startup there will be a big impact. And the number three, as far as the investment, the foreign direct investments are concerned, around $4 billion investment from China took place in the last 2019. So Chinese foreign direct investment is there. China is a very active partner in our startup industry. And then of almost $90 billion bilateral trade, 73 or $74 billion are Chinese import to India. So naturally, if we stop this, we are importing it because we are finding it cheap there. So that means this will affect our common man also, because if you are able to get some cheap Chinese product, it's pure economics. It's not that only China is benefiting because of their export. We are also benefiting because we are able to buy it at a cheaper cost. So there is going to be mutual hurt. There will be hurt for both sides. It's not that only China will be affected, because we have a substantial bilateral economic engagement between India and China. So it is not a one-sided business. It is going to be affecting both the sides, and India may be hurt more than China in this present context.